May 11, 1945. 1400 hours, radar picket station, 15, 75 miles northwest of Okinawa. In the Combat Information Center of USS Hugh W. Hadley, radarman second-class Bob Carr watched his scope with growing disbelief. The phosphorescent blips multiplying across his screen violated every tactical doctrine he'd learned at radar school in San Diego. "Sir, I'm counting. I'm counting over 100 contacts inbound, range 28,000 yards and closing." Lieutenant Commander Baron Mullaney, the destroyer's executive officer, leaned over Carr's shoulder. What he saw on that glowing screen would, in the next 90 seconds, prove or disprove 3 years of American scientific investment. Over 150 Japanese aircraft fighters, bombers, and rocket-powered suicide weapons were converging on Hadley and her sister ship, USS Evans, in what would become the most concentrated kamikaze assault against 2 isolated vessels in the entire Pacific War. The question that would be answered in the fire and chaos of the next hour and a half was simple. Could American technology defeat human sacrifice when compressed into its most extreme form? If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. On Hadley's weather deck, Gun Captain Marvin Beery's 5-inch gun crews were already loading shells marked with distinctive yellow bands and cryptic VT stenciling. Each shell contained a miniaturized radio transmitter smaller than a milk bottle, housing 130 electronic components manufactured to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. These proximity fuses represented one of the 3 most closely guarded secrets of World War II, protected at the same classification level as the atomic bomb and British code-breaking operations at Bletchley Park. What made these shells revolutionary was brutally simple. They knew when to explode. No longer did gunners need to estimate exact distances, calculate projectile flight times, manually set mechanical fuses, and pray their mathematics matched reality. The VT fuse transmitted continuous radio waves and measured their reflection. When the Doppler shift indicated proximity to a target, any target within 70 feet, the shell detonated automatically, transforming near misses into kills. By May of 1945, this technology had been operational in the Pacific for over 2 years, but never tested against anything like what was approaching Hugh W. Hadley. The Kamikaze pilots closing on Radar Picket Station 15 represented the Imperial Japanese Navy's ultimate expression of desperation. Following catastrophic defeats in the Marianas Turkey Shoot and the destruction of Japan's carrier fleet, Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi had proposed the formation of Tokubetsu Kogekitai Special Attack Units in October of 1944. The mathematics seemed favorable to Japanese strategic planners. Conventional attacks achieved hit rates of only 2% against heavily defended American ships. Early kamikaze attacks in the Philippines had achieved success rates exceeding 34%. A single pilot in a Mitsubishi Zero carrying a 250-kilogram bomb could potentially sink a destroyer, trading 1 life and 1 obsolete aircraft for hundreds of American casualties and millions of dollars in warship damage. The logic was brutal, but from Japan's perspective, mathematically sound. The pilots now approaching Hadley had undergone abbreviated training that emphasized spiritual preparation over flying skills. Many had fewer than 100 hours of flight time, compared to the 500-plus hours their predecessors possessed at Pearl Harbor. They had written final letters to their families, participated in ceremonial sake toasts, received samurai swords or rising sun headbands, and had been told they were the divine wind that would save Japan. What their commanders had not told them could not tell them, because Japanese intelligence had failed completely to understand it, was that they were flying into the most sophisticated anti-aircraft system ever deployed in naval warfare. The technological disparity was absolute. While Japanese Type 98 anti-aircraft guns still relied on mechanical time fuses requiring manual setting before each shot, American destroyers at Okinawa carried thousands of shells equipped with miniaturized electronic brains. Each VT fuse represented a technological achievement Japanese industry could not replicate even if given complete blueprints. The development of the proximity fuse had begun in 1940 under emergency conditions. Dr. Merle Tuve, heading Section T of Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory, assembled a team of physicists and engineers to solve what seemed an impossible problem: create a reliable fuse small enough to fit in an artillery shell, rugged enough to survive being fired from a gun, and sophisticated enough to sense proximity to aircraft. The technical challenges had been staggering. The fuse's vacuum tubes, manufactured by Sylvania Electric using designs adapted from hearing aids, had to withstand acceleration forces of 20,000 times gravity when fired from a 5-inch gun. The projectile would reach 2,600 feet per second while spinning at 25,000 revolutions per minute. Every component, glass tubes, copper circuits, miniature batteries, radio transmitters, had to function perfectly after this violent launch, then operate reliably in temperatures ranging from 100 degrees to -50 degrees Fahrenheit. German scientists had attempted developing similar technology, researching over 30 different proximity fuse designs. They had concluded it was impossible. Japanese engineers, receiving fragmentary intelligence reports about Allied special ammunition, reached the same conclusion. The Americans, they believed, might have improved radar or faster-setting mechanical fuses, but self-detonating electronic shells were physically impossible to manufacture. They were catastrophically wrong. By May of 1945, American factories were producing 70,000 proximity fuses daily. The Crosley Corporation alone, which had manufactured radios and refrigerators before the war, employed 10,000 workers across 3 shifts, producing fuses 7 days a week. RCA, Eastman Kodak, General Electric, and McQuay Norris, combined with 87 different firms using 110 factories engaged in various phases of production. The scale was unprecedented. Each fuse cost had dropped from $732 in 1942 to just $18 by 1945, through mass production efficiencies that exemplified American industrial might. Quality control was absolute. Every fuse underwent multiple tests, random samples were fired in test guns, and rejection rates remained below 2%. This massive industrial mobilization ensured that Hugh W. Hadley's magazines held over 2,000 proximity-fused 5-inch shells as the Japanese attack force closed to weapons range. The contrast in defensive philosophy was equally stark. Hadley and Evans had been positioned 75 miles from the main fleet, specifically to provide early warning and absorb the initial kamikaze onslaught. This was the doctrine of radar picket duty: small, fast destroyers equipped with the best radar and fire control systems, placed deliberately in harm's way to protect the invasion fleet anchored off Okinawa's beaches. Each destroyer carried 6 5-inch guns capable of firing 15 rounds per minute when properly crewed. With proximity fuses, these guns transformed from area denial weapons into precision instruments. A 5-inch VT shell had a lethal burst radius of 70 feet compared to just 20 feet for time-fused shells. More critically, the fuse eliminated the complex calculations required for conventional anti-aircraft fire, allowing gunners to engage targets immediately upon detection. The Japanese approaching Hadley had no conception of what this meant. Their tactical doctrine assumed that high-speed, low-altitude approaches would minimize exposure to anti-aircraft fire. Kamikaze pilots were taught to approach at wavetop height to avoid radar detection, then pull up at the last moment for their final dive onto targets. This tactic had worked devastatingly well in the Philippines campaign, when proximity fuses comprised only 25% of American anti-aircraft ammunition. By Okinawa, that percentage had risen to 75%. The Americans had learned, adapted, and industrialized their solution. Commander Baron Mullaney understood what the numbers on his radar scope meant. Over 150 aircraft against 2 destroyers meant overwhelming odds by any conventional calculation. But Mullaney also understood something the Japanese commanders planning this attack did not. His ship carried weapons that would turn mathematics on its head. At 1407 hours, the first wave entered the gun range. Hadley's forward 5-inch mounts opened fire at maximum effective range 18,000 yards, over 10 miles. The distinctive crack of 5-inch guns firing at maximum rate echoed across the empty ocean. Each shell climbed toward the approaching formation, spinning at 25,000 RPM, the miniature radio transmitter in its nose already broadcasting signals. What happened next would be studied by naval tacticians for generations. The proximity fuses began detonating with mechanical precision. Black puffs of explosion appeared among the Japanese formation, not scattered randomly, but clustered exactly where aircraft flew. The fuses were working as designed, each shell exploding within lethal range of targets, filling the air with steel fragments traveling at supersonic velocities. The first Kamikaze, a Nakajima B-6N JIL torpedo bomber, simply disintegrated. One moment it was boring in toward Hadley at 250 miles per hour. The next it was tumbling wreckage falling into the sea 3 miles from the destroyer. The pilot never knew what hit him. No tracers gave warning. No direct impact, just sudden catastrophic structural failure as proximity-fused shells detonated above, below, and beside his aircraft. Then the second fell. And the third. Gun Captain Beery's crew was firing in a rhythm they'd perfected through months of combat load. Aim, fire, 15 rounds per minute from each mount. The proximity fuses turned every shell into a hunter. Gunners didn't need perfect accuracy anymore, didn't need to calculate exact trajectories or lead times. They needed only to fire shells into the general vicinity of targets, and the electronic brains in each shell's nose would do the rest. The Japanese kept coming. Through the wall of VT-fused explosions, through the black clouds of detonating shells, through air so thick with steel fragments that it seemed impossible anything could survive, the Kamikazes pressed their attack. At 1412 hours, 5 minutes into the engagement, USS Evans reported splashing her first kamikaze. The Japanese aircraft, a Yokosuka D-4Y Judy dive bomber, had attempted the standard tactic of approaching at wave-top height. The proximity fuses, designed to work at any altitude, detonated when shells passed within 70 feet of the ocean surface, creating a horizontal wall of fragments that shredded the low-flying aircraft. Hadley's radar men were calling out contacts continuously now. Multiple bogies, bearing 035, range 14,000, bearing 180, range 12,000, bearing 270, range 10,000. The Japanese were attacking from all directions simultaneously, trying to overwhelm the destroyer's defensive fire through sheer numbers. It was the tactic that should have worked. Conventional anti-aircraft doctrine held that concentrated attacks from multiple axes would saturate defenses. Some aircraft would inevitably get through. The mathematics of aerial combat favored the attackers when they accepted unlimited casualties. But the mathematics had changed. At 1418 hours, 11 minutes into the battle, something extraordinary happened. A formation of 7 kamikaze aircraft, 3 Zeros and 4 Vals, approached Hadley from the northwest in a coordinated attack pattern. They were flying in a tight V formation, engines at maximum power, pilots committed to their final dives. Gun Mount 52, commanded by Gunner's Mate First Class Robert Johnson, tracked the formation. Johnson's crew had been firing continuously since the engagement began, their 5-inch gun barrel already heating to temperatures that would require water cooling. The loader slammed another VT-fused shell into the breach. Johnson confirmed the target bearing, the automated fire control system calculated the solution, and the gun fired. The shell climbed toward the kamikaze formation, its proximity fuse broadcasting radio waves that reflected off the tightly grouped aircraft. At precisely the calculated moment, the fuse detected proximity to multiple targets simultaneously. The detonation occurred at the geometric center of the Japanese formation. What followed defied belief. The single shell, exploding among 7 aircraft flying in close formation, destroyed or critically damaged all 7 simultaneously. The proximity fuse had turned 1 shell into 7 kills. Flaming wreckage tumbled from the sky in a cascading sequence of secondary explosions as aircraft fuel tanks ignited. 7 pilots, 7 aircraft, 7 suicide missions ended by one $18 proximity fuse functioning exactly as designed, and the crew of Gun Mount 52 was already loading the next round. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The battle had been raging for 13 minutes. In those 13 minutes, Hadley's guns had fired 192 rounds of 5-inch VT ammunition. Japanese aircraft were falling from the sky at rates that seemed impossible, but the sheer numbers meant some were getting through. At 1421 hours, a Zero fighter, trailing smoke from proximity fuse damage, crashed into Hadley's forward superstructure. The explosion killed 11 men instantly and started fires that would rage for hours. But even as damage control parties fought the flames, Hadley's guns never stopped firing. At 1423 hours, exactly 16 minutes after the first shot was fired, the moment occurred that would enter naval history. A massive formation of Japanese aircraft. Later intelligence would estimate 31 individual aircraft, including fighters, dive bombers, and even one of the rocket-powered Oka suicide bombs converged on Hadley from multiple bearings in what was clearly intended as the killing blow. The Japanese had observed Hadley's damage from the first kamikaze hit. They saw smoke pouring from her superstructure. They assumed, reasonably, that this wounded destroyer could not survive concentrated assault from over 30 aircraft attacking simultaneously. They were about to discover how wrong that assumption was. Every gun on USS Hugh W. Hadley that could still train on a target was firing. The 5-inch main battery, the 40mm Bofors mounts, the 20mm Oerlikon cannons all converging their fire on the swarm of aircraft closing from every compass point. But it was the 5-inch guns with their VT-fused ammunition that would determine whether Hadley survived the next 90 seconds. Commander Mullaney, standing on the bridge despite the inferno raging below, watched the sky fill with black bursts of proximity-fused detonations. The pattern was unlike anything seen in previous naval engagements, where conventional anti-aircraft fire created scattered explosions requiring direct hits or near-perfect timing. The VT fuses were creating a 3-dimensional grid of lethal fragments. Every shell that entered the formation exploded at the optimal moment, its electronic brain calculating proximity with inhuman precision. The first kamikaze in this massive formation, a Mitsubishi A6M0, reached firing range at 1423 hours and 30 seconds. Gun Mount 51, still firing despite the flames spreading across Hadley's forward deck, sent a VT-fused shell directly into the Zero's flight path. The shell detonated 40 feet from the aircraft's engine cowling. Steel fragments traveling at 3,000 feet per second shredded the Zero's thin aluminum skin, severed control cables, and punctured the fuel tank. The aircraft rolled inverted and plunged into the ocean 800 yards short of Hadley. 30 more aircraft were still coming. At 1423 hours and 45 seconds, Gun Mount 52 destroyed 2 IHED-3A Val dive bombers with a single proximity-fused shell. The aircraft had been flying in tandem, separated by less than 100 feet. The VT fuse, detecting both targets simultaneously, detonated between them. Both aircraft fell into the sea, 28 aircraft remaining, 45 seconds elapsed. The Japanese pilots, even in their final moments, must have experienced profound confusion. Their training had emphasized that American anti-aircraft fire required them to fly straight long enough for gunners to establish accurate range and trajectory. Evasive maneuvering was supposed to reduce hit probability, but the proximity fuses invalidated these assumptions entirely. Shells that would have missed by 50 feet with conventional fuses now detonated lethally close. Evasive maneuvers simply carried aircraft into different sectors of the VT grid, where other shells were already waiting. Gun Captain Beery's crew was firing with mechanical efficiency born of endless drills. Load, aim, fire. Every 6 seconds another shell climbed toward the formation, another electronic hunter seeking targets. The crew didn't know they were making history. They knew only that aircraft kept coming and their guns kept firing and the proximity fuses kept working. At 1424 hours 60 seconds into the 90-second engagement, Hadley's main battery had destroyed 17 aircraft. 14 remained in the formation, now closing to within 2,000 yards. Some were damaged, trailing smoke and flames from near misses that had torn chunks from wings and fuselages but hadn't brought them down. Others were untouched, their pilots committed to impact regardless of the carnage surrounding them. The Oka rocket bomb, released from its carrier aircraft at maximum range, was accelerating toward Hadley at over 400 miles per hour. This piloted missile, carrying 1,200 kilograms of explosives, was theoretically unstoppable once released. Its small size and extreme speed made it almost impossible to track with conventional fire control systems. Almost impossible. The SCR-584 radar system, guiding Hadley's main battery, locked onto the Oka at 1,424 hours and 15 seconds. The radar calculated trajectory, speed, and optimal interception point with electronic precision impossible for human gunners. Gun Mount 53 received the firing solution automatically and fired. The proximity-fused shell climbed into the Oka's flight path. The fuse detected the high-speed target and detonated at the precise instant of closest approach, 38 feet from the rocket bomb's nose. The explosion didn't destroy the Oka outright. Instead, it severed the control surfaces and punctured the rocket motor casing. The Oka tumbled out of control, its pilot struggling desperately with useless controls as the crippled missile plunged into the ocean 600 yards from Hadley's starboard beam. The explosion when it hit the water sent a geyser 100 feet into the air. Had that warhead struck Hadley, it would have broken the destroyer in half. 13 aircraft remaining, 75 seconds elapsed. The intensity of fire was reaching levels that tested the physical limits of both weapons and crews. Gun barrels were glowing red from continuous firing. Loaders were moving shells with burns on their hands from touching hot metal. Spent shell casings littered the decks, making footing treacherous. The air was thick with cordite smoke and the acrid smell of burning paint and electrical insulation from the fires still raging amidships. But the guns kept firing. At 1,424 hours and 30 seconds, Gun Mount 54 destroyed a Nakajima B-6N JIL torpedo bomber that had approached to within 1,500 yards. The proximity fuse detonated directly above the aircraft's cockpit. The pilot died instantly, and the JIL, its controls unresponsive, spiraled into the sea. 12 aircraft remaining. Gun Mount 51 destroyed another Val dive bomber at 1,424 hours and 40 seconds. The aircraft had been approaching in a steep dive, the tactic that historically gave kamikaze pilots the best chance of penetrating anti-aircraft fire. But the proximity fuse tracked the diving aircraft, the shell climbing to meet it, detonating when the descending aircraft entered lethal range. The Val disintegrated at 800 feet altitude, large sections of wreckage falling dangerously close to Hadley's fantail. 11 aircraft remaining, 80 seconds elapsed. The mathematics of the engagement were becoming clear even as the battle raged. 31 aircraft had attacked Hadley in a concentrated formation over 90 seconds. The destroyer's VT-fused ammunition was destroying them at a rate that should have been statistically impossible. Conventional anti-aircraft doctrine held that destroying aircraft in such conditions required an average of 1,100 rounds per kill. Hadley was achieving kills with an average of fewer than 15 rounds per aircraft. The proximity fuse had transformed naval anti-aircraft warfare from an exercise in probability into a precision science. At 1,424 hours and 50 seconds, two events occurred simultaneously that would have destroyed Hadley under any previous technological regime. A Zero fighter, damaged but still flying, entered its final dive toward the destroyer's bridge from bearing 030. At the same instant, a Yokosuka P-1Y France's bomber approached from bearing 180, pilot committed to his kamikaze dive. Two attackers, two different bearings, both within seconds of impact. Under conventional fire control, gunners would have had to choose which target to engage, accepting that the other would almost certainly strike home. But Hadley's fire control system, guided by radar and freed from the limitations of mechanical fuses, engaged both simultaneously. Gun Mount 52 fired at the Zero. Gun Mount 53 fired at the France's. Both shells climbed toward their targets. Both proximity fuses detected their designated aircraft. Both fuses detonated at the optimal moment. The Zero, hit by fragments that severed its tail section, tumbled out of control and crashed into the sea 50 yards from Hadley's port side. The Francis, its wing torn off by the proximity fuse detonation, cartwheeled across the water and exploded 400 yards from the destroyer's starboard quarter. 9 aircraft remaining. 85 seconds elapsed. The Japanese formation was disintegrating. What had been a coordinated attack by 31 aircraft had become a series of individual suicide dives by increasingly desperate pilots watching their comrades fall from the sky. Some tried radical evasive maneuvers, hoping to throw off the American gunners' aim. Others committed to straight-line approaches, accepting that they would likely be shot down, but hoping their flaming wreckage might still strike the target. None of these tactics worked against proximity fuses. Gun Mount 54 destroyed another Zero at 1425 hours exactly. The fighter had been flying at wavetop height, attempting to use ground clutter to mask its approach. The proximity-fused shell detonated when passing 70 feet above the ocean surface, creating a horizontal cone of fragments that caught the Zero in mid-flight. The aircraft disintegrated, pieces skipping across the water like stones. 8 aircraft remaining. 90 seconds elapsed, and then, as suddenly as it had intensified, the immediate crisis passed. The remaining 8 aircraft, scattered across the sky, were being engaged by USS Evans and by Hadley's shorter-range 40mm and 20mm guns. 3 more would be destroyed in the next 2 minutes. 5 would break through the defensive fire. One of those 5, a Zero fighter trailing smoke and flames, crashed into Hadley's after-engine room at 1426 hours. The explosion killed 21 men and knocked out the destroyer's propulsion. Another struck amidships, starting new fires. A third hit near the forward gun mounts, killing gun Captain Beery and most of his crew, the men who had just saved their ship by destroying unprecedented numbers of attackers. But Hadley survived, burning, listing, dead in the water, but afloat. And the reason she survived was mathematical. Of 31 aircraft that attacked in concentrated formation, 23 had been destroyed by proximity-fused 5-inch shells in 90 seconds of firing. The remaining 8 faced shortened odds. Only 5 actually struck the destroyer, and 3 of those were damaged aircraft that caused less destruction than fully functional kamikazes would have inflicted. Without proximity fuses, conventional anti-aircraft doctrine and combat experience suggested that perhaps 5 to 8 aircraft might have been destroyed in the same time frame. The other 23 to 26 would have struck home. No destroyer could survive that level of damage. Hadley would have been obliterated, her entire crew of 330 men lost. Instead, she stayed afloat. 267 of her crew survived. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The battle continued for another hour. Japanese aircraft kept coming in smaller groups and individual attacks. Hadley's surviving gun crews, working around dead and wounded comrades, kept firing. By 1530 hours, when the last Japanese aircraft withdrew, Hadley had expended 262 rounds of proximity-fused 5-inch ammunition. Combat analysis would later determine that these 262 shells achieved 31 confirmed kills, aircraft completely destroyed and confirmed falling into the ocean, plus damage to at least 15 other aircraft that either crashed elsewhere or were finished off by Evans or by fighter cover that arrived late in the engagement. The mathematics were extraordinary. 31 confirmed kills from 262 shells meant an average of 8.4 shells per aircraft destroyed. Conventional time-fused ammunition required an average of 1,162 shells per kill under similar combat conditions. The proximity fuse was 138 times more effective. This wasn't theory or speculation. It was empirical data written in expended shell casings and flaming wreckage. USS Hugh W. Hadley remained afloat through the night of May 11th, her crew fighting fires, shoring up damaged bulkheads, and treating the wounded. At dawn on May 12th, tugboats arrived to tow the destroyer back to Karamaretto, the fleet anchorage where repair ships waited. Hadley would never fight again, her damage was too extensive for field repairs, but she had accomplished her mission. The radar picket stations had absorbed the kamikaze onslaught, preventing those aircraft from reaching the vulnerable transports and supply ships anchored off Okinawa's invasion beaches. Commander Mulaney, standing on what remained of Hadley's bridge, watched the sun rise over an ocean littered with debris. Pieces of Japanese aircraft floated everywhere, sections of wings, tail assemblies, shattered propellers. Oil slicks marked where aircraft had gone down. The evidence of the previous day's carnage stretched for miles. Later, Mulaney would write in his after-action report, "The proximity fuse proved decisive in this engagement. Without VT ammunition, this ship would certainly have been sunk with all hands." The fuse transformed what should have been overwhelming odds into a survivable fight. It is my assessment that the VT fuse represents the single most important anti-aircraft development of this war. His assessment was shared throughout the fleet. Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner, commander of amphibious forces at Okinawa, compiled reports from every ship involved in the campaign. The statistics were consistent across hundreds of engagements. Ships equipped with adequate supplies of proximity-fused ammunition survived concentrated kamikaze attacks at rates 3 to 4 times higher than ships relying primarily on conventional ammunition. The destroyer USS Laffey, attacked by 22 kamikazes on April 16th, fired 345 rounds of VT ammunition and destroyed 9 attackers outright. She was hit by 6 kamikazes but survived. Statistical analysis indicated that without proximity fuses, Laffey would have been struck by at least 15 aircraft damage no destroyer could survive. The destroyer USS Morrison, defending radar picket station number 1 on May 4th, exhausted her supply of proximity-fused ammunition after shooting down 8 kamikazes in the first 20 minutes of battle. Forced to rely on conventional time-fused shells for the remainder of the engagement, Morrison's kill rate dropped precipitously. She was struck by 4 kamikazes in rapid succession and sank in less than 3 minutes, taking 152 men with her. The pattern was absolute. Proximity fuses meant survival. Their absence meant death. For the Japanese pilots who survived aborted missions, the experience of attacking American ships at Okinawa was one of psychological devastation. Lieutenant Tatsuo Hayashi, a kamikaze pilot who aborted his mission due to engine failure and lived to write about it after the war, described approaching an American destroyer through what he called an invisible wall of death. "The shells exploded everywhere," Hayashi wrote in his memoir, "not scattered randomly as we expected, but precisely where we flew. It was as if the Americans could see exactly where each aircraft would be and place explosions at those exact points. My squadron of 7 aircraft was reduced to 3 before we even came within range to begin our final dives. The 3 of us who survived to attempt our attacks were all damaged, our aircraft riddled with fragments from explosions that seemed impossibly accurate. I saw my friends die not from direct hits, but from shells exploding near them close enough to kill, but far enough that our intelligence officers told us such hits were statistically impossible. We had been assured that American anti-aircraft fire required direct hits or perfect timing. We discovered that the Americans had somehow transcended these requirements. Hayashi's engine failed during his dive, forcing him to ditch in the ocean. He was rescued by a Japanese submarine and returned to Kyushu, where he reported to his commanding officers what he had witnessed. His report was dismissed as combat stress and exaggeration. The idea that American shells could detonate automatically when near targets was considered technically impossible by Japanese weapons experts. This intelligence failure would persist until Japan's surrender. Despite hundreds of combat reports describing the devastating accuracy of American anti-aircraft fire, Japanese high command never grasped that they faced proximity-fused ammunition. They attributed American effectiveness to improved radar, faster reacting mechanical fuses, or simply better trained gunners. The truth was more fundamental. The Americans had developed weapons that thought for themselves. Vice Admiral Matome Ugaki, directing kamikaze operations from Kyushu headquarters, noted in his diary entries from May 1945, "Success rates continue to decline. Fewer than 1 in 5 special attack aircraft now reach their targets. The enemy's defensive fire has become extraordinarily effective through means we do not understand. Pilots report shells exploding with impossible accuracy. Some suspect new types of ammunition, but our technical experts assure me this is unlikely. More probably, the Americans have achieved improvements in fire control coordination. Ugaki was wrong. His technical experts, brilliant engineers who had designed some of Japan's most advanced weapons, were trapped by their own assumptions. They knew proximity fuses were theoretically possible. German intelligence reports captured in 1943 had mentioned Allied research into such devices, but Japanese attempts to develop similar technology had failed completely. The technical challenges of miniaturizing vacuum tubes to survive gun launch, creating batteries that could remain dormant for years then activate instantly, manufacturing precision radio components by the millions, these seemed insurmountable to Japanese industry, already stretched to breaking by 4 years of total war. If Japan, with its vaunted engineering prowess, couldn't solve these problems, how could the Americans have done so? This failure of imagination cost Japan thousands of aircraft and pilots in futile attacks against defenses they couldn't comprehend. The strategic implications extended far beyond the Battle of Okinawa. American war planners preparing Operation Downfall, the invasion of Japan scheduled for November 1945, based their casualty estimates partly on proximity fuse effectiveness. Intelligence indicated Japan had reserved approximately 10,000 aircraft for kamikaze attacks against the invasion fleet. Without proximity fuses, these attacks might have sunk or disabled hundreds of ships, killing tens of thousands of American sailors and potentially making the invasion impossible. With proximity fuses, American planners calculated that defensive requirements could be met. Production schedules called for 100,000 VT fuses daily by September 1945. Every destroyer, cruiser, and battleship in the invasion fleet would carry magazines full of proximity-fused shells. New Mark 53 and Mark 58 fuses with improved sensitivity and reliability were entering mass production. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So, if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The invasion fleet would have deployed with over 1 million proximity-fused shells, creating anti-aircraft defenses of unprecedented density. Japanese kamikaze attacks, no matter how numerous or how fanatically pressed, would have broken against this electronic wall like waves against rocks. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August ended the war before this final test could occur. But Japanese military assessments captured after surrender revealed that their planners understood, dimly, what they faced. Admiral Soimu Toyoda, chief of the Naval General Staff, testified during post-war interrogations that the Japanese Navy had calculated homeland defense kamikaze attacks would achieve less than 10% success rates against the American invasion fleet based on observed effectiveness of American anti-aircraft defenses at Okinawa. We knew our special attack tactics were failing, Toyoda admitted. What we did not know was why. We attributed it to improved American radar and fire control. Only after surrender did we learn about the proximity fuse. When American technical officers explained the device to us, we could not believe such technology existed. Our scientists examined captured examples and confirmed they were genuine. It was a profound shock. We had been fighting with weapons from one era against weapons from the next. The human cost of this technological disparity was written in stark numbers. During the entire Okinawa campaign from April 1 to June 22, 1945, Japanese forces launched approximately 1,900 aircraft in organized kamikaze attacks. American naval forces destroyed hundreds before they reached their targets, with proximity fuses accounting for the vast majority of kills at medium and long range. While kamikaze attacks sank 36 American ships and damaged 368 others, these losses represented survival of the vast majority of vessels attacked. The 4,907 American sailors killed by kamikazes at Okinawa, while representing the Navy's bloodiest single battle, were a fraction of casualties that would have occurred without proximity fuses. Statistical analysis by the Naval Operations Research Group calculated that without VT fuses, kamikaze attacks would have sunk at least 150 American ships at Okinawa, with casualties exceeding 20,000. The proximity fuse, by this calculation, saved over 15,000 American lives during the Okinawa campaign alone. Across the entire Pacific War, from January 1943, when the first proximity fuse was fired in combat, to August 1945, the Navy estimated that VT ammunition prevented the loss of several hundred ships and saved between 40,000 and 50,000 American lives. For Hugh W. Hadley's crew, the statistics were more personal. Of the 31 kamikazes destroyed in 90 seconds on May 11th, at least 20 of those aircraft would have struck the destroyer, if not for proximity fuses. Each additional hit would have killed more men, started more fires, inflicted more damage. At some point, probably after the 10th or 12th hit, Hadley would have sunk. The proximity fuse was the difference between 267 survivors and 0 survivors. Gunner's mate Robert Johnson, who commanded Gun Mount 52 during the battle, survived his wounds and returned home to Ohio in December 1945. In a letter to his family written aboard the hospital ship taking him back to the United States, Johnson described his experience. "We were firing so fast the gun barrel was glowing red. The shells just kept working, every one of them seemed to find a target. I didn't know what made them so effective. The officers told us they were special ammunition, but not what made them special. Now they tell me our shells had tiny radios inside that told them when to explode. It seems impossible, like something from a science fiction story. But I saw what those shells did. They saved our ship. They saved my life. Whoever invented those fuses, I hope they know what they accomplished. They turned a fight we couldn't win into a fight we survived." The inventor Johnson referenced Dr. Merle Tuve would receive numerous awards for his proximity fuse work, including the Presidential Medal for Merit. But Tuve consistently deflected credit, pointing instead to the thousands of engineers, workers, and soldiers who transformed laboratory concepts into battlefield reality. In a speech given at Johns Hopkins University in 1947, Tuve reflected on the proximity fuse's impact. "We developed a technology that saved lives by making weapons more effective. Every kamikaze shot down by a proximity fuse meant American sailors who went home to their families. That was worth any amount of effort and expense. But the real achievement wasn't the science, it was the collaboration. Scientists designing components, engineers solving manufacturing problems, factory workers maintaining quality standards, sailors trusting their weapons to work under the worst conditions. That collaboration, possible only in a democracy where people work together voluntarily toward common goals, was what defeated Japan's forced sacrifice." The contrast Tuve identified, democratic collaboration versus totalitarian sacrifice, defined the fundamental difference between American and Japanese approaches to warfare. Japan had mobilized its young men as expendable weapons, burning human lives to achieve tactical effects. America had mobilized its industrial capacity to create weapons that preserved lives while achieving strategic victory. The proximity fuse embodied this philosophy. $18 of electronics and mass production could destroy a kamikaze aircraft worth thousands of dollars and carrying a pilot whose training had consumed months of scarce resources. When multiplied across thousands of engagements, this equation translated into American victory through technological superiority. For Japan, the failure to develop or even understand proximity fuses represented the culmination of a war-long pattern of technological blindness. Japanese industry had produced remarkable weapons: the Zero fighter, long-lance torpedoes, the Yamato battleship. But these weapons represented individual brilliance rather than systematic innovation. Japan never achieved the integration of science, industry, and military requirements that allowed America to produce revolutionary technologies at massive scale. The proximity fuse required cooperation between universities, private companies, and military services. It required sharing of information, rapid prototyping, acceptance of failure as part of development, and massive investment in manufacturing infrastructure. These were things totalitarian systems with rigid hierarchies and resource scarcity could not accomplish. Japanese officers interrogated after the war expressed consistent amazement at American proximity fuse technology. Commander Tadashi Nakajima, who helped establish the Kamikaze program, stated, "When they showed us the proximity fuse and explained how it worked, I understood why our tactics failed. We were sending men to die against weapons that could think. The Americans valued their sailors' lives enough to invest billions in protecting them. We spent our men's lives as if they were ammunition. In the end, their machines defeated our men, and we learned that modern war belongs to those who can build better technology, not those who can inspire greater sacrifice." The proximity fuse's legacy extended far beyond World War II. The technology pioneered in those desperate years from 1940 to 1945 became the foundation for modern guided weapons, radar altimeters, and electronic warfare systems. Every proximity-fused artillery shell, every air defense missile with active radar seeking, every smart munition that can sense and respond to targets all descend from the VT fuse developed to stop kamikaze attacks. The principle proved timeless. Weapons that can think for themselves are more effective than weapons that rely solely on human accuracy. This concept, revolutionary in 1945, became central to military technology throughout the Cold War and remains fundamental to 21st century warfare. USS Hugh W. Hadley was towed to Kuramaretto on May 12, then to Guam, and finally back to San Francisco, where she arrived in July 1945. Surveys determined her damage was too extensive to justify repair. She was decommissioned in October 1945 and sold for scrap in 1946, but before she was broken up, the Navy preserved detailed records of her final battle. The after-action reports, damage assessments, and crew testimonies became teaching materials at the Naval War College. For decades, the engagement of May 11, 1945, was studied as the definitive example of proximity fuse effectiveness against concentrated air attack. The lesson was clear. Technology could multiply defensive capability to levels that changed tactical mathematics. Two destroyers with proximity fuses could defeat attacks that would have overwhelmed a dozen ships equipped with conventional weapons. Commander Mullaney, promoted to captain and given command of a cruiser, carried lessons from Hadley throughout his post-war career. In lectures to Naval Academy midshipmen in the 1950s, Mullaney emphasized that Hadley's survival was not about courage or training, though my crew showed both in abundance. It was about having weapons that worked better than the enemy believed possible. The proximity fuse turned statistics on their head. It made the routine impossible. That's what superior technology does. It changes the rules of engagement in ways your enemy can't counter. The 31 kamikazes destroyed in 90 seconds on May 11th became a benchmark for anti-aircraft effectiveness. No other engagement in World War II saw such concentrated destruction of attacking aircraft in so short a time frame. The record stood not because other ships lacked courage or training, but because no other engagement combined such overwhelming attack concentration with such perfect conditions for proximity fuse employment. For the families of the 31 Japanese pilots who died in that 90-second span, the war ended on a destroyer's gun line southwest of Okinawa. They died believing their sacrifice would save Japan, unaware they were attacking weapons their commanders had assured them didn't exist. Their courage was real, their sacrifice complete, but their mission was doomed from the moment American factories began producing proximity fuses by the thousands. The tragedy was not in their deaths, all war is tragic, but in the waste. Young men with potential futures expended against a technology that made their sacrifice strategically meaningless. Had Japanese leadership understood what proximity fuses were and what they meant, would they have continued kamikaze operations? The question haunted Japanese military planners for decades after the war. In the end, the story of Hugh W. Hadley and the 90 seconds that defined proximity fuse warfare contains a truth about modern conflict. Industrial capacity and technological innovation can overcome any advantage in numbers or determination. The Japanese had assembled 150 aircraft against 2 destroyers, overwhelming odds by any historical standard. But the Americans had assembled the electrical genius of Sylvania, the manufacturing capacity of Crosley, the radar expertise of MIT, and the systematic testing of Johns Hopkins into shells that knew when to explode. 150 aircraft against technology that thought for itself. The mathematics were never in doubt. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.